Good afternoon, everyone. We're now on time, so we'll just get started. Welcome to the KCI's event, Just Transition in Energy Sector, Leaving No One Behind. I have the honor to moderate today's session. My name is Sangji. I'm a global technical specialist with UNDP's Climate Strategies and Policy team based in New York, and also serve as a thematic lead on just transition within the team. So before we start, it will be great to maybe start with the short introduction of the panels. As you see, we have many panelists on the table today. So to my left is Peter Govindasamy. He also serves as a co-chair of the KCI, and also he's the director of the Climate Change International Team in the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industry. We also have Catherine Goldberg. She's also the co-chair of the KCI, and she has worked on the climate policy with the U.S. Department of State since 2016. We also have a Professor Wang. He's a General Secretary of the Research Center for Sustainable Development based in China, and he also serves as a member of KCI. And to my left, we have Mark Hagen. He works with the Just Transition Center. He's a policy advisor with the Just Transition of the International Trade Union Confederation, focusing on just transition strategies and sectoral trade unions, and previously worked on the German trade union coal phase-out and regional restructuring project. We also have Agnes Vinblad. She works with the United States Council for International Business, and she's the policy manager for environment and sustainable development. And we also have the David Waskow. He is the director of the WRI's International Climate Initiative. So we have 6 excellent speakers and panelists today. So as we have all seen, just transition is key for the energy transition. We've learned from the history that without very deliberate efforts and strategies to manage the transition efforts will be met by social protest, and that will ultimately really slow down the entire decarbonization efforts and energy transition efforts. So we believe this session today is very timely, and then of course we'll focus on hearing a lot of interesting insights and experience from different experts on how can we implement the just transition strategies, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the first question for today. That's going to be a common question for all the panelists. So how have just transition strategies been implemented in the energy sector? We heard that we have a very diverse mix of panelists today in the workers' unions, or from the perspective of academia, or from the perspective of the government. How do you see the transition strategies have been implemented? So that's going to be a same question for all the panels. So I'll start with Peter. Peter, can you maybe take this question? Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon. First, I'm speaking on behalf of the KCI. And we are excited of the level of interest. The room is bursting at the seams, for want of a better way of describing. But I just also want to acknowledge that my fellow KCI members are here. Firstly, Catherine, my co-chair, and you have Jan Willem, who's sitting over there, Angelina over here, Stig, and I see Alexandra, one of our newest member in the crowd as well. So we are very excited, and we are inspired by your attendance and the interest. As a first point, I want to highlight that just transition has been an integral part of the KCI, and of course the response measures track for more than 10 years now. Since Katowice, we have a very structured way of dealing with these issues to address the economic and social impacts of response measures. And one of the key thrusts is the recognition that economic diversification and just transition are key to build countries' resilience, as all of us support the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So if I can just speak on just transition, it is a key issue. The way we look at just transition, we see it as an enabler for enhanced climate action. So recognizing that, and it's a key component of our work program, pursuant to the Madrid work plan, which was formulated in 2019, We have a number of activities that specifically speaks to the notion of just transition. The KCI has actually completed many of its studies, many of its work plan activities. In fact, one activity that which has received much acclaim and references is this one, which was published recently, which contained case studies on just transition examples across a variety of countries. For example, it has US, South Korea, Colombia, and even countries closer to where I come from, Singapore, countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and Marshall Islands. And the example of Marshall Islands is interesting because it talks about the training of young women as technicians for solar-powered equipment in the Marshall Islands. So that speaks to the issue that in just transition, it's not about addressing the concerns of men workers, but also the vulnerable groups, female girls, indigenous group as well. And that's one key element that we are very sensitive to, that in our submission that we also address how just transition addresses vulnerable groups as well. So I actually recommend this publication. You can actually get it from the KCI website, which contains specific examples on just transition challenges and the opportunities as enablers for enhanced climate action. So in addition to that, the KCI is actually currently working on another submission on just transition, which will be published in a few months' time. The title of the submission is called Tracking Progress on Just Transition. So in this is a another exciting product of the KCI. If I can just give a preview, one of the aspects of this publication is that we recognize while government action is fundamental for climate action, for just transition, but governments alone cannot do this. You need the private sector. So we recognize that large companies need to be active and take on responsibilities in facilitating a just transition. Just transitions, I will say with a plural. In fact, the publication will contain short summaries of actions that the private sector has taken to support just transitions. And it also, actually, the submission also look at sectoral analysis of actual just transition implementation experiences. It shows, it speaks to a number of government policies that are already in place, but it also highlights that government policies need to extend beyond skills and training, particularly just transition planning that includes social dialogue and stakeholder engagement. So this again reinforces the point that just transition is a multifaceted issue, needing a multifaceted response. So not only governments, private sector, but there need to be social dialogue, engagement with various parties or stakeholders. So again, look out for this submission, which is going to be published soon. And I like to add, there's another, besides looking backwards, looking at the existing sectors like coal, oil, gas, the KCI also ensures that we are forward-looking. So we look at sectors of the future that is so important for climate mitigation. Let me just cite three areas that we are currently looking at, is hydrogen, CCUS, and AI. AI as an enabler for both these low-emission strategies. So there is another publication we are doing is the impact of relating to new industries such as hydrogen, CCUS, and AI. Again, that publication is going to be circulated soon, perhaps in a couple of months' time. I again would like to invite you to look at that submission because it talks about just transition perspectives of new emerging low-emission technologies. So this is another aspect I want to highlight, that in all our KCI work, we are not only looking at just transition challenges which are highlighted about the multi-dimensional nature, but also we need to be cognizant of challenges that will come up as we develop new low-emission strategies such as hydrogen, CCUS, and that will have its own just transition challenges as well. So in a nutshell, that's what KCI is doing, but I'll be happy to, if you have any further comments or questions with respect to KCI work, I'll be very happy to respond to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter, for introducing the latest publication. I think it's also available online, so we really encourage participants to check it out. Now let's move to Catherine, who is also the co-chair of the KCI. The same questions. How have just transition been implemented? Just transition strategies been implemented, I think, in the U.S. context. Over to you, Catherine. Thank you.
Thanks. Does this work? Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'll speak on behalf of the U.S. And just to say, Peter, thanks for a great introduction for all the work that KCI is doing. From a U.S. view, we align with a lot of what Peter highlighted. So, for us, just transition, it really is an enabler of domestic climate action, and it's a pretty critical part of our mitigation action policies domestically. It's something that's pretty new, I think, in the climate arena, and certainly in the U.S., we're still learning about what works related to just transition, what doesn't work, and even within the U.S., what works in one area or even one city might not work in a different city. So just to say that it's something that, is really applicable to all countries, to all areas within a country, and I'm really excited to learn more from everyone here, as well as share the U.S. experience. So I'll just share two ways that we've been implementing just transition in the U.S. The first is through our Inflation Reduction Act, which was one of our climate economic bills passed late last year. It focuses a lot of the investments on support for renewable energies through tax credits for things like zero-emission vehicles, for renewable energy development, also various incentives for investment in, for example, solar companies within the U.S., so providing some federal support to incentivize their production. Also, a piece of that goes towards repurposing existing fossil fuel infrastructure, so sort of emphasizing the importance of reusing existing infrastructure where possible. Another important part of it is its emphasis on carbon abatement technology, and for us, that's also a pretty critical part of just transition. So that act also incentivizes a lot of CCUS and CCS. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is our work with private sector communities. As Peter mentioned, it really is the private sector that will really help drive up the investments at scale that we need to transition to net zero economies. So for us, a key part of our work on mitigation in general and supporting communities transition to renewable energy is through our private sector partnerships. So just two examples, we have a partnership with a company that focuses specifically on battery storage build-outs and in areas of the U.S. that are traditionally more fossil fuel communities, so sort of supporting their efforts to move from being employed in fossil fuel infrastructure to working in battery supply chain, which I think also speaks to the importance of economic diversification and the link that economic diversification and just transition have, certainly within the U.S. context. That's really relevant. Another big public-private partnership that we have is focused on nuclear power build-outs. So again, looking at fossil energy facilities across the U.S. and where those may be able to be repurposed into nuclear facilities, and supporting workers as they transition from one skill set to another potentially. So those are just two examples that I wanted to highlight. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, also has a focus on supporting specific vulnerable communities identified throughout the U.S. who might be most impacted by the transition to net zero. And so those investments that I talked about earlier also try to target specific communities that are the most vulnerable and the most hard hit. So for us, it's very important, as we're implementing these policies, to really be identifying those people most vulnerable and engaging with them to make sure that the policies we're implementing are actually the ones that will support them. So I'll pause there. Just wanted to give those couple of examples from the U.S. view. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Just for your information, we'll have a Q&A session later, so please hold on your questions, but we'll come back to you. Thank you, Catherine, for sharing all these interesting strategies that the U.S. government has been taking in terms of the legislative support to the public-private partnerships and also technological support as well. So now we'll move to Professor Wang. So maybe if you can share some of the experience in China, that would be great. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. Does it work? Okay, thank you, Chair. I will sharing some our understanding on just transition, just from maybe I'm not sure this is a delegation point of view. Mostly I think that from a personal point of view. And since just transition have low agreed definition among the world, so we may have various of understanding for just transition. But from my point of view, the just transition is obviously is not transition, or transitions means a lot of things, a lot of sectors. But for me, the just transition means a very limited, sectors in the process of addressing climate change, and these sectors might have big challenge. Those sectors are mostly, the traditional sectors like fossil fuel sectors. So when we talk about just transition, I just want to focus more on just transition, because this is more focusing our study, or more focusing our concern. This is my first point. And my second point, that is in China, just transition is a quite new topic for China. Since this is not a really new concept. So this concept was appears in the 1970s, all right? At that time, the people addressing the environment issue, and some of the industries and some of the people, they are facing challenges during the environment governance process. And the just transition was introduced in climate change regime in the year 1997. The year that Kyoto Protocol was agreed. So at that time, climate change people are concerned with this issue. But as you know, this issue is really hot is after the year 2020. So why it is after 2020? Just because a lot of country has proposed their carbon neutrality targets. So in that sense, a lot of people viewed there's a very big change in the future from economic and social point of view. That is why a lot of concern, a lot of people caring about just transition. In China, we are not in the name of just transition to dealing with that transition issue of the some kind of coal-based area. In China we use another wording, which is resources-based economy, or resources-based cities transition. Because some of the cities, after many years, development of, coal mining, they do not have any more resources for those kind of cities. They use out of their resources. So these cities, they are facing to transition to another kind of city. It may not be a resources-based anymore. So it's need to shift to another kind of economy. So China is dealing with the just transition issue, just in that context, that is resources-based city shift or transfer. So we have done quite a lot of things for that, including everything you can imagine. That we have the regional development policies or sustainable development policies, and we have issued various of the finance policies to support the coal-based areas for the transformation, and also for the labor support policies. A lot of policies. I just stop here at a lot of time, and I will come back for the other topic. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Wang. And thanks for bringing that important aspects that the just transition has to be locally and nationally defined. Of course, it means different things for different countries, as countries have different socioeconomic challenges. And as Professor Wang mentioned, there's no universally agreed definition of just transition. So thank you for that. And now we'll move to Mark. Mark, yeah, if you can share your insights. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for putting on this event and including us and inviting us as the trade unions and worker representatives. Thank you to the KCI co-chairs and the contributors to this publication that was just recently presented also here at the conference. I think that everybody should have a look at that, and thanks for the inclusion of some of the examples that include the examples of trade union work in the Philippines, in the case that interests us, of course. But beyond that, if we look at the just transition processes in the broader energy field, I think from a trade union standpoint, we can say that we've had the most sort of advanced success in those areas where we've entered into negotiations on a national, regional, and company level regarding the phase out of coal, and are now moving into other sectors. It's in each one of these cases, it's a complicated puzzle, and as yet, outside of the coal area, I think we have to say that we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle in place in each of these sectors or subsectors or related sectors in terms of the broader question of energy supply and the use of fossil fuels or phasing out of fossil fuels. Where we have strong trade unions, we have solid agreements with companies and governments, and that also brings me back to some of the guiding principles that we as worker representatives would like to focus on to make sure that if we are talking about a just transition from our standpoint, then we do speak about some fundamental principles that perhaps have not been agreed upon by all parties in the context of this conference, unfortunately, because it makes the conversation about it somewhat difficult. But in the context of the broader UN bodies, we do have the International Labour Organization, where we do have a definition of just transition that we consider a working definition, and that is that just transition means greening the economy in a way that is as fair and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned, creating decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind. Now, we've heard those terms used in the past couple of days in many cases here from parties, from other consulting bodies and groups, us included, of course. I would like to focus on some of the challenges, because where, like I just mentioned, we have strong trade unions and strong engagements with governments and companies, such as in the German coal mining phase out, or in the Spanish examples where we have national compromises that enable a socially just and green transition from coal to other forms of energy, that always include a number of boxes to tick. Let me put it that way. We need sorry, losing track here. We need the trade unions at the table on the one hand, but we also need a sort of anticipation of the change process that include planning and not just here's a decision and now please deal with it. That includes getting communities, the workers, other stakeholders, not only the workers, because that has also been a case that has been repeatedly mentioned in the course of the conference, Many parties have stated it's not only about labor and work. No, that was the whole point of inventing the just transition terminology, which came from trade unions in the 1980s, because we want to expand the whole process. We need social protection guarantees. So if we transfer workers from one industry and from one area to another without a described transition from coal into other industries or from coal into retirement, where there might be a gap, then we end up with what Peter has mentioned on briefly touched upon, and others, where we have dangers of social unrest that will arise from the inequalities that might come up if one industry is just turned off. The same holds true, and this is something that we've learned in the German example. We need very strong policy decision-making on national, state or regional and local levels from the governments to ensure that we have a regional restructuring. Many of the industries, such as oil, gas, coal, and others, are very regionally dependent. They are concentrated in areas. In the South African example, they are concentrated strongly in one province. And we have to find ways to then not only engage the workers there and get them to another place of work, like you mentioned in the case of the United States, where the government is enabling such things, which we strongly welcome because we need that. But also, how do we restructure the entire economic makeup of such a region that was dependent on mostly from one individual industry? And that in some cases includes entire countries, not just regions. So we are working very intensely with our constituents and affiliates in the Middle East and North Africa region, where we have countries like Iraq, who is upwards of 90% dependent on the oil industry. So we need a pathway out of that if we are going to talk about an actual just transition. And that means that there has to be an incredible effort at planning and implementing and accompanying with policy economic diversification. We certainly don't have time to go into the full aspects of how do we finance that. There are many events at the conference here that also touch upon these topics. So for our side, we are working strongly on training and awareness raising in our membership, that this is a necessary and possible path of engagement. We are initiating collective bargaining with the companies and respectively then also advocating for appropriate policy responses with the governments on national and company levels, but also on global levels, where we are trying to implement so-called global framework agreements. These are agreements that we sign as trade unions with the largest companies in the world, and up till now they have been addressing more things like collective bargaining and classic trade union activities, but now also include just transition. And finally, what we need on top of all that is apart from our own activities and the policy responses from government, we need good faith bargaining and engagement, especially with the fossil fuel industry, with the trade unions in individual countries, but also in the regions inside those countries and at the global level, to be able to then actually ensure a just transition for the workers and the worker communities, because we fully recognize that it's not only about the employees of those companies, it's about the young people, it's about the women in those areas, it's about the communities that the workers also live in. They are part of the communities that are affected. They are not aliens outside of that whole setting. So I think I'll stop at that point.
Thank you so much, Mark. Peter said that this just transition is a very multifaceted issue, and I think Mark has done very well in providing solutions, multifaceted solutions, ranging from early planning, social dialogue, also the engagement of the private sectors, and of course the policy measures, as well as the regional restructuring and the diversification. So I think now it's a great segue to now hear from the business perspective. So I'll move to Agnes for sharing the perspective from the Business Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here today for this very important conversation. And I think it fits into what's been mentioned just now by both Peter and Mark, and the critical component of coming together in dialogue. So truly very pleased to be here. I represent the U.S. Council for International Business, And again, as mentioned initially by Peter, the question of a just transition is truly a multifaceted problem, and it is indeed need of multifaceted solutions. And I was particularly happy to hear the reference to social dialogue. In my role at USCIB, we actually are also the U.S. affiliate to the International Organization of Employers, the IOE. And through that standing as an organization, we are also the U.S. employer's voice in negotiations at the ILO, and an active participant in the social dialogue that takes place at the ILO. So the ILO work on just transition was, again, just referenced by Mark, and the ILO just transition guidelines are the results of tripartite negotiations between experts representing 162 governments, employers, and their associations and unions. And through IOE, USCIB was a part of those negotiations establishing the ILO just transition guidelines, so truly bringing the employer's voice to the concept of just transition. And from an employer's perspective, again, keeping it a bit surface level for now, because I know we need to move forward to the designated questions, but from an employer's perspective, that tends to mean the encouragement of and the investment in specifically targeted reskilling and upskilling opportunities. And just looking more concretely at the actions being carried out by the energy companies already today, there certainly is a critical focus on green job creation and reskilling of their workforces. And some concrete examples of this includes taking stock of the skills along the whole value chain of an asset, and evaluating how to best support the reskilling of every single worker involved. For example, this could mean retraining exploration geologists to utilize their existing geoscience skills for carbon storage or underground energy storage, or to locate and mine critical minerals that will be very needed for the energy transition. I could also just emphasize that many skills learned in technical and leadership career paths in the oil and gas industry are transferable to careers in other industries, including those focused on low emissions technologies. And I think this fits into an overall energy industry focus on advancing a lower carbon future that is focused on actions and investments in core areas of really lowering carbon intensity of existing operations, while simultaneously also encouraging the growth of efforts in lower carbon energy options. And I also think we heard from Catherine earlier on the very critical role of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and the already very positive encouragements and actions we're seeing happening due to that in the US. And there are policies included in the IRA that encourage further development of the use of advanced technologies such as CCUS, and these are very much actions that are already happening on the ground for all major energy companies globally. But I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for Agnes for sharing those business perspectives and their role in social dialogue, but also in all these reskilling and upskilling trainings as well. So now let's move to David from the WRI to share some of his insights. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to touch on 4 points. I know I have 1 minute each, so I will try to move quickly. So first, I think we've seen a shift in how just transition is understood over the past several years. And in many ways, it was often looked at in a specific sector, coal, and especially in terms of labor. Now, as Mark pointed out, the ILO guidelines are a good bit broader than just labor questions, and in fact touch on a number of other issues having to do with affected communities, including gender, I would note. But I think that if you asked somebody in this room 4 years ago, they probably would have immediately thought of labor and coal when talking about just transition. That has changed. The sectors have broadened quite a bit, including in energy, to oil and gas now being discussed. We're doing some work on that, and to a number of other sectors. It's also the case that affected people, the notion of who's affected has broadened considerably. So includes a number of marginalized communities among those that we need to have in mind when we're looking at these issues. And it's expanded geographically. And we're now thinking, I think we heard examples of this. We're now looking broadly at the global south as well as the global north. And that is a very salutary development in the last several years, I think. So that's point one. Point two, stakeholder engagement, inclusive participation in policymaking. We've heard discussions of we've heard mentions of social dialogue. I would underscore all of that. Social dialogue sometimes, by the way, refers very specifically to tripartite dialogue. So I would underscore the importance of talking about inclusive policymaking in general terms in addition. Some developments on that front that are important, I think, to keep in mind and have been positive developments. The development of commissions at national level on just transition. Germany, Spain, Scotland are important examples, and South Africa's Presidential Climate Commission is another example. It's developed a just transition framework that I would commend to everyone. I think it's quite helpful to look at, both in terms of process and in terms of its policy conclusions. That's the second point. Third point has to do with what we are thinking about when we talk about the transition. Often we're looking at negative effects on communities, workers, et cetera, as we transition away from high carbon models of economies and societies to zero carbon ones. And so that's workers in fossil fuel sectors, for example, just to, name one, as I said, name one part of the puzzle. But I think we also now increasingly need to look at what happens as we transition into the good stuff. And for example, we're seeing cases in a number of countries, not a huge number so far, where the development of large-scale renewable infrastructure raises important questions around land rights, water rights, who has access to employment. Are particularly poor workers able to access employment in those situations? You can think about these questions of access, of just transition across a number of sectors and a number of dimensions. And I think that that's very important to address going forward. Last point is on finance. Money, money, money. I think we've started to see increasing attention to this, and certainly the EU with its Just Transition Fund has been out in front. That funding goes to member states for affected communities, affected regions. And we're now at a point where I think we need to look at international finance as well, what the architecture for that is, what do we need to finance for just transition. And we're seeing some cautionary notes, I would say, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, for example, that I think have not touched adequately on just transition, and so we need to think about that and the questions that poses, as well as looking to how we can in fact finance just transition effectively.
Thank you, David. As you mentioned, yes, the global discourse on just transition has really expanded in the recent years. So we're even talking about the just transition more in a broader sense. In the UNFCCC negotiations, there will be a new work program on just transition. So I see it as a positive developments in that sense. We actually had prepared a second set of questions for each panelist, but given that we had so many participants in the room, so I thought it's better that we kind of have this interactive session from now on without going to the second session, if it's okay with the panels. Okay, that's great. So I'll open the floor for any questions. We have heard from business perspectives, workers' perspective, the governance perspective, the think tank perspectives, all this expertise. Is there any specific questions that you have? So I'll start with this gentleman here. And then, yeah, yes.
Is it on? Yeah. I think it's coming.
I don't think it's working yet.
I can just speak loudly. It's fine.
Yeah, I think we're on phone because it's live stream, so it would be good to capture the question, but I think we could just start.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so I'll speak a bit loudly. So I'm Chris. I work for RescuePU, the European Federation of Cities and Energy Cooperatives. And I'm interested to hear what... Okay, let's try again. Now? Is it? Yeah. So, sorry about the repetition. I'm Chris. I work for RescuePU, the European Federation of Cities and Energy Cooperatives. And I'm very interested to hear, and this goes to all of the panels, so please feel free, any of you, to answer if you have any insights on what is your stance towards local ownership of renewable energy and actually, recycling, let's say, the benefits, the revenues within local communities co-owning the projects and co-benefiting from them, as opposed to just, big companies or, moving from a bottom up to from a top down to a bottom up.
Thanks a lot. I'll just repeat the question for the sake of online participants. So the question is, what are each panelist's stance on the local ownership of the renewable energy projects in terms of the revenue and also the co-ownership? So we'll take a couple more questions and then we can answer it all together. So I think the next is on the third row. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Myself, BP Pati, I'm representing Government of India. I should agree with Mr. David that just transition perspectives now widen up beyond energy. When Katowi Summit happened, it is basically the transition from one source of energy to a greener and clean energy and its other impacts, socio-economic impacts and workforce, etc. As this concept going to widen enough, perspectives going to change, there is another perspective in this just transition. Just transition from low consumption of energy countries to at least a respectable consumption of energy and vice versa. So why not consider this thing, because the climate resilience going to be impact those countries much more, and they have all the things, have all the means to have the just energy security in their areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we get the questions? Okay. Maybe can you repeat the first question? Sorry about that. I've got the second question. But...
To add another perspective to the just transition from the energy, from one source of energy to a clean and green energy. This dimension is just transition from low consumption of energy, per capita energy economy, to at least respectable consumption of energy economy. Thank you.
Okay. I guess that's more of the question of how do we define the transition to what, transition of what? I guess the question is like that. But yeah, let's take one more question. From Angelica.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the insight of our just transition from the various perspectives. Just a question: how useful is policy coherence in all this? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. So we'll close the floor for now, and hopefully we'll have another round of Q&A sessions. So we got 3 questions. I hope we all have took notes of that. So the first question is about the local ownership of the renewable energy, and then also the revenues and so on. Second, about the definition of just transition from what, to what, of what. I guess that's my interpretation, but correct me if I'm wrong. The third one is how do you make sure the policy coherence among these different interventions, basically. So who wants to start first?
I'd be happy to talk about the local ownership at least.
Yes, Mark, please go ahead.
So at least from the standpoint of the trade unions, I think I can safely say that in many cases, not to overgeneralize, but we strongly welcome local energy supply and local renewable energy networks and the like. I think that, and we think that it can be a very, very strong contribution to energy security for our own members ultimately, because they are the ones that are working there. And up to now, if an energy worker is working in a coal mine or an oil field, that doesn't mean they have more energy security than anybody else on that market. In the case of that kind of local ownership, it can be a strong contribution to exactly that, and also benefit the communities in other ways in terms of being able to invest in other types of infrastructure. And ultimately being a way to also possibly, at least, take a more active part also in terms of employment. We've seen bad examples in investing in renewables, such as in Scotland, where the renewable development was handed over to large international companies, and the employment impact was very low, unfortunately. From what it could have been if it had been local, regional, or at least national for Scotland solutions.
Thank you, Mark. Anyone else want to add to that question from the panel? Okay, then maybe we could talk about the third question on the policy coherence, and maybe if any panels from the government side. I'm looking at Catherine. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. So a couple comments. It's certainly the U.S. view policy coherence, like within our government, is definitely pretty key. I think a lot of the efforts are the incentives I talked about earlier through the IRA are sort of helping to create this domestic enabling environment, which we view as pretty critical to just transition to ambitious mitigation policies. And certainly that requires policy coherence among our multitude of various government agencies. So in terms of just one example, we are using an interagency working group to focus specifically on coal communities, for example, within the United States, looking at the ways that various U.S. federal agencies can support those coal communities as they transition away from or out of their coal jobs. But that does really require the various agencies and entities to be closely coordinated to make sure their policies are working together and supportive of each other and not against the goals of the various policies. So it's definitely tough when you have a sort of sprawling government enterprise, but it's pretty crucial, I think, to be coherent across agencies. So just to share that example.
Thank you, Catherine. So anyone wants? Yes, Professor Wang.
Here's Mike.
It's on.
Yeah, it's good. Here's the mic. Thank you. I think, from my understanding, that policy coherence should be in different levels, on international level or national level, or maybe regional level or city level, a different kind of policy coherence. And I think for international level, we should have a policy coherence about the mitigation action, mitigation policies, as well as social and economic development policies. This should be linked between SDG policies with mitigation, climate change mitigation policies. That would be international level of policies coherence. For national level, I think that is a very much important one, because the areas that facing that just transition might not have the fully competence for their just transition. They need some coordination within or under the national level. So that would be very much important. So in China, we view that central government need to set up some kind of leading organization on this kind of work, and also this national level policies need to be fully coordinated with regional one or city one. And the third level should be the regional or the city level. So that is a very much important one. And for example, that is for the city development planning, we need to select it out what will be the future development policies and what kind of policies should be that very much supportive to enact or to help to realize the development strategy of the city. So from my analysis, that should be a different level, and this will be very much helpful for coordinate of different levels of policies making. So thank you.
Thank you very much. David, you wanted to add something on that?
Thanks. The first point I would make is a very basic one, just that just transition requires long-term deliberate planning, inclusive processes, and if that's done well, it is something that ideally leads to policy coherence. And it's an underpinning, I think, for just transition. And it's, given that it is a transition that is happening over time, we want to move quickly, but it is one that happens over time and will have real consequences down the line. One needs to look far ahead. The second thing is around coherence with fiscal policy. And we've been looking a lot at the oil and gas sector from a just transition lens. And there we're seeing that, and I think it's more so than in the coal sector, we're seeing that there are many middle-income developing countries that are quite dependent on revenues and other revenues from the oil and gas sector, from the oil and gas production sector. Some of those revenues, of course, don't necessarily go where one would want them to, but some of them, in fact, do make it to social programs, subnational governments, and so forth. So this, in fact, can pose a real challenge for communities on the ground, even if those revenues decline over time and there hasn't been planning done to really address that shift in the revenue base. We're seeing economic diversification as a really important part of the puzzle. And obviously this is not an easy task, much easier said than done, but nonetheless critical. It's important from a fiscal point of view, but also from the point of view of workers and communities and what happens actually on the ground, where some of the effects are happening. So to do economic diversification right, that is fundamentally about policy coherence, right? And to the point that was just made, one really has to think of that in broader terms. It's not just shifting from let's say fossil energy to clean energy. That should be part of the puzzle, but it may involve agricultural processing. It may involve digitalization and moving into those domains. And one can go down a long list. And that will require significant coherence across government and across the society, including, I would just end with those who are responsible for fiscal policy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that comprehensive answer. And Peter, do you want to come in as well?
Yeah, thank you. First, let me just completely share with the point that Professor Mao made earlier. Coherence has to take place at various levels, of course, internationally, nationally. But my comment, I want to focus on coherence at the national level. When I began my introduction earlier, I made a statement which everybody would agree in this room. Just transition is an enabler for climate action. I think it's a truism, it's something that all of us agree. But I'm sure all of us will also agree that just transitions, a successful just transition is not going to take place by chance. It is not going to fall from the sky like manna in heaven. So there need to be proactive action. Actually, there need to be a proactive effort, first and foremost, at the national level. So that's where coherence at the national level is important. For example, if a country is thinking of looking at hydrogen as an option to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement, there are various implications. You need to train workers. There's no point just developing hydrogen when there are no workers to operate or implement them. So we need to train workers. So the schooling system in line to support that? At the higher level, polytechnics, they have systems in place to train people who can operate hydrogen systems, if I can say that. So the notion of skilling, upskilling becomes very important. And this cannot be done by, for example, the ministry, the energy ministry, who is thinking of hydrogen. It has to be done with the Ministry of Education, whole of government effort. So there has to be coherence in any climate action. And that actually speaks to NDCs. NDCs are by no means costless. NDCs will have cost on the country, and therefore, first and foremost, there must be coherence at the whole of government level. But obviously, at the whole of government level, as Professor Mao highlighted very importantly, for hydrogen to develop, for the country to develop, it must have enablers, not only at the domestic level, you need to have infrastructure, other enablers in place, but at the international level, is there environment to foster the growth, the investment, the development of hydrogen? Are there sharing of good practices? So enablers applies at the international level as well. So the notion of good practices is important. But if I can just come back to another related point. So the right question to ask is, how can just transition be an enabler for climate action? I think that's the question we should always ask. Then when we ask the question, then we need to talk about coherence, what we need to ensure that countries are able to realize successful just transitions with a plural. Then, but we also need to accept that people are going to be affected. So there need to be a whole of society response. Then we need to address everyone who's going to be affected in the society, the vulnerable groups, women, children, indigenous people, young, who looking for a brighter future. So everybody is going to be affected. So the question is, in looking at just transition policies, how are we going to come with something that is inclusive? I think that's important. Again, that reinforces the point there need to be a whole of government, forward-looking, deliberate consideration. We need to have the policies in place even before we have, for example, moved the country into a hydrogen economy. And the last point I want to highlight is that another question we should ask is, how is society is going to be incentivized to support the government in having climate action? So then the direct people who are going to be affected are workers. So you need to have social protection. The issue of social dialogue is important. In many countries, including Singapore, we have a robust tripartite system where government, trade unions, workers, their views are sought so that the policies we effect preemptively understands the issue. So in that regard, sorry if I can just read from a quote from the publication, KCI publication is coming up on this point about, so it says, companies are important because ultimately companies create jobs. It says here, companies tend to focus on creating jobs, green jobs, without necessarily a long-term plan to protect workers, suppliers, and communities affected by low-carbon transition. So the report goes on, when assessing just transition policies, it is therefore important to examine how employers are aligning with such policies, as there can indeed be a gap between good intention just transition policies and how companies are supporting just transition efforts. So all in all, it's a great challenge, but whenever there's a challenge, as the Chinese will say, there are many opportunities. So we need to work together to harness the opportunities. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. I think you have really wrapped up all those important points while posing a last question to our colleague for Agnes, maybe if you wanted to say something from the business perspective. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. And I promise I'll be brief, but I can just say that the question of policy coherence is truly, truly critical, especially from an employer's perspective, a business perspective. We look to efficient policy to know what to do and how to act and how to implement what's needed to be implemented. So policy coherence is critical, and it's truly posing a greater and greater challenge because there are so many initiatives and so many national policies and then global policy development happening, and the interoperability of all of these various policies and initiatives is posing a greater and greater challenge, and is something that definitely needs to be considered to a further extent if we really want private sector to be able to take meaningful action. And then I'm going to be a little bit provocative and say something that I've heard from members, so member companies that are active in the energy sector. And when I speak to them, I've heard now multiple times, we don't have time to wait for policymakers. We are doing it ourselves. Now, yes, that is perhaps a slight simplification. I think we can all admit to that. But I also think we can see the sentiment in that statement that, for example, quickly, like the major energy companies do represent the largest investors in renewable energy. And I think that there's a need for clear, decisive policy to know how to further incentivize and encourage those type of actions. And this certainly applies to LDCs and SIDs and, every geography that businesses operate across. So I think it poses a real challenge. And then I just really also want to emphasize the critical need of linking policy conversations with conversations of finance and investment. Again, I want to raise a very good example that took place just here in Bonn this weekend, right before the session started, the first global dialogue of the mitigation work program, and how that was linked with a conversation on investment. An investment-focused event was linked directly to that dialogue. And that is something that I very much would welcome, and I think business at large would really welcome seeing, to constantly link policy with the investment incentives and the financing that's needed to meaningfully and rapidly implement and act on these policies. Because, again, I have to simply point to the IRA. I know Catherine has mentioned it many times, but I really do think, again, from a business perspective, it truly does illustrate a very efficient incentivizing policy tool that I think will be critical to facilitate a just transition.
Thanks a lot, Agnes. That's a very important point about this incentive structures and the long-term policy signal. And we are now in this UNFCCC session, so I also wanted to highlight that Peter talked about the NDC, which is more of the short-term climate pledges, but there's also a long-term climate strategies called the long-term strategies. So that's usually providing a much longer signal of travel, so it actually sends a stronger market signal. Hey, investors, it's safe to invest on low carbon technologies because we're going to do this by 2050. So that kind of shows and sends a much longer term signal to the market. So understanding those different instruments, international instruments, is also very important. Now I think we have about 10 minutes left, so I'll just open it up for another round of quick questions. Oh. Yeah, I'll start with the gentleman here and also the lady in the back. I know she has been raising it for a long time, and also here in the third row, and then the last one. Yeah, thank you. Are you checking? Yeah.
Is that working? Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Jörg Linke. I'm working with the German International Corporation, GIZ. I have one question directed to the colleagues from KCI. Thinking a little bit from the end, you mentioned the monitoring of just transition. And I would like to know, beside the climate impact and beside all what has to do with labor and decent work, what can you imagine could be interesting indicators, maybe to look from 10 years later, what are the indicators which indicates the just dimension? My question.
Thank you for the good question. I'll give the floor to the lady in the back. The one in the back. Yeah.
Well, good afternoon. I have a question regarding someone mentioned the jet piece and said that the just part of the transition was not really addressed. And I would like to know why is it so? And in your views, what could be done to actually solve this issue? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll take more. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know which is working. I wanted to pick up on that question of indicators, given the uptake we've heard of the popularity of this concept, and hear panelists' views on whether and how they think there's a need for greater quality control over just transition claims and commitments, particularly by the private sector, and a bit akin to the Secretary General's campaign in the Integrity Matters program, where there's a significant need to combat greenwashing. So too, I think increasingly will there be a need to combat just transition washing, and how do you see that evolving? What do you think is needed, whether that's the formalization of a definition, the creation of an international standard, or anything in between?
Thanks for the good question. Yes, the gentleman in the next. Yep.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jose Bravo, and I sat in a room with Tony Mazzocchi almost 30 years ago. And we developed, I'm with the Just Transition Alliance, and we developed the process of a just transition and how it's grounded with workers and communities of color, indigenous peoples, and low-income communities in the United States. So part of what my question would be is, how do you address, we've taken some surveys of workers in refineries, and Tony used to work for the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. And we've taken surveys of folks in refineries, chemical plants, and such. And, you know, doing away with fossil fuels isn't the biggest fear. The biggest fear is automation, right? And how automation is taking place in some of these sectors and taking jobs as well. And then how do you address things like that? And then another piece is that coming from the environmental justice communities in the United States and indigenous communities, we believe that when we talk about hydrogen and many other solutions, so-called solutions, the impact's going to be back on communities of color and low-income communities throughout the planet, not just in the United States, of course. So how do you address that?
Okay, thank you. And then, sorry, one last question, because he has been raising the hand for a long time. And then we'll need to close it. Apologies that we couldn't take all the questions.
My name is Giovanni from German Watch. My question is more towards a connection between local, what they call it, ownership and so on, but also to the national level policy, which is SOEs, state-owned enterprises. How do you guys see the multiple role that SOEs can take, both as employers, both as probably the main miners in a country, also the main utility companies? So how they can play a role in the just energy transition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We are almost close to time, but I will try to wrap up many questions. So I think first we can discuss the transparency issue, the verification and the monitoring of the just transition commitments coming from the private sectors, and also the government's commitments as well. So if anyone from the panel wants to take the question first, and then we'll move to the next one. Yes, Agnes.
I could just come in briefly on that question, because I think it is a really important one. And I also appreciate the reference to the UN H-led report, Integrity Matters, and perhaps even more recently, the document that was released by UNFCCC earlier this week, well, at the end of last week, I guess, on June 4th, on the recognition and accountability framework. So again, not to repeat myself, but I'm going to say that, again, as business and industry, we certainly do look towards policy clarity and certainty to be able to carry out what needs to be carried out. So I think that that's a very timely and good question to pose. All I can say as well is that the critical component of that is to really make sure that business is consulted in the development of a standard and of these processes and of these policy mechanisms, because it is always a concern that there will be unintended consequences, and not the least when you talk about LDCs and SIDs and understanding local capacities in adjusting to certain perhaps overly ambitious targets or indicators. And again, I'm actually going to reference a topic that came up during the first global dialogue on the MWP earlier this weekend, there were some parties that raised the question of a global energy efficiency goal. And then there was actually a significant amount of parties saying that, well, that would probably pose real challenges for developing countries who lack the capacity to rapidly fulfill or even roll out anything that would be needed to fulfill such a overarching global standard. So I think that if we are capable of truly allowing for national circumstances to be considered, I think that that is certainly, in terms of the just transition and understanding what it means, that's something I've heard from our members as well, that, oh, it is a bit difficult to really take meaningful action if you don't have the policy definition of what it means. Because you're also running into the risk of perhaps getting out ahead of yourself and starting a program that you believe is aligned with a just transition, but then if an actual definition comes out after the fact, you might have to more or less start from the beginning, which also poses a risk to business. So it's, yeah, I think it's a good question and something that we should talk about and consider, and I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. I think that was a really good question, and thanks for that answer. And also, just for your information, I think we have a colleague in the room. There's also this World Benchmarking Alliance. This is an alliance that's looking at the country's just transition efforts. So if you're part of these alliances, they have a certain metrics to measure the company's just transition corporate behaviors and also their practices. So I think we're seeing a bit of a growing momentum on trying to also verify and put some more transparency into this just transition work. So hopefully with the government side as well, if it's becoming part of the MRV system later on, as we discuss more and more about this, then hopefully that's the direction that we're also hoping as well. And the next question is about the JET-P that I need to ask David, if you can maybe clarify that.
Yeah, and if I might, just a few words on indicators first. And I think there's important relationships between indicators and the situation we find ourselves in with the JET-Ps. But on the indicators, we're doing some work now with the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, ICAT, on developing indicators. It's a complicated question, and we, in fact, will welcome from everyone here, in fact, thoughts as we go through that process in terms of what are the most important and most appropriate indicators. One thing that I would note is that process questions are quite important. What happens in terms of social dialogue, inclusive policy processes, and stakeholder engagement really are at the heart of just transition. And although often that's qualitative in nature in terms of how we can track or measure it, it is absolutely fundamental. Then there are other questions such as what is actually being done as part of just transition efforts. So, how many people are reskilled, what's done in terms of community economic development, you can go down a list. And then lastly, what are the effects over time, which I think was a lot of what you were getting at. And what can be measured is sometimes not adequate, or what is being measured is sometimes not adequate to what we would like to see. We don't have a lot of subnational statistical databases, for example, and in many cases, just transition really does depend on knowing what's happening at the subnational level. On the JET-Ps, I think there is a risk, and this goes to the question about the private sector that was raised, but I think it's equally true of governments. There is a risk of just washing. In the instance of the JET-Ps, and really what we've seen so far is mostly the South Africa case. The others are not far enough along to really reflect on at this point, I think, at least not fairly to do so. What we saw in the South Africa case is that it was in many ways a non-transparent process. There had been a just transition framework developed by the Presidential Climate Commission in a way that was quite transparent, quite consultative. But the JET-P process itself was not, I don't think, can be characterized as being open and transparent and inclusive. The other question is the dollars on the table, frankly. And 97% of the finance as part of the JET-P, the $5 billion in total that is being provided by donors. 97% of that is in the form of loans, only 3% in grants, and less than 1% is going or was promised to go to social efforts, reskilling, et cetera. And so the social dimension really dropped out of the picture, I would say, in that case. We're now early days for Indonesia and Vietnam. I do think that there in Indonesia and in Vietnam some early questions about process, but there's still a ways to go. And I think the question is, can it become a more inclusive process in those countries? And are the dollars going to be there, frankly, to go to the just transition dimension?
Thanks, David. Mark, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, mainly thanks, David, because you really covered, I think, the main points that we would have made as trade unions in general. I just want to give one example that regarding the South African example, beyond the money on the table or the loans versus grants at the moment. In terms of transparency, neither the trade unions in South Africa, so I have a colleague from COSATU here in the room with me today, so and perhaps others, I'm not sure, but neither they nor the trade unions of the potential donor countries are fully aware or cognizant of what is actually in what we would consider essentially a black box of the JPs. There is almost no information to be gained at the moment from governments on any of the sides in terms of recipients or donors. It's a very difficult process. And we are to the level where we say we need to actually unravel this whole thing and put it back on its feet the right way around.
Okay, thanks. And I think, Peter, you wanted to answer some of the questions raised?
Just very briefly to the very important question that our colleague from GIZ asked about indicators for just transition. I think that's a very pertinent question, particularly now that we are developing the just transition work program. So obviously this needs further thought, but to me, one ready point of reference to develop indicators will be the UN Sustainable Development Goals. For example, just a cite couple, what affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth. So I'm just citing two, but certainly we should take actually first and foremost reference from the SDGs. In the context of the KCI, this is something that we are looking at. We are developing a framework, which should probably be one of our next publications. But before I end, I think we should respond to the very good question that our colleague from India asked. Not fully respond to his question, but I think he raised the notion of energy security. I think even as we look at just transitions, I think it's important that we do not forget energy security. Not only energy security for country as a whole, but also energy security for people, and particularly the poor and vulnerable. So I think that has to be foremost as we look at just transition strategies. And I thank the colleague from India for that question.
Thanks for picking up the question as well. We have two remaining questions. We're running out of time. The first question is about the impact of the automation. And the second one is about the state-owned enterprises vis-a-vis the local companies. If anyone wants to take that questions from the panel. On the role of the state-owned enterprises in the just transition. Yes.
So, of course, automation for labor has always been, for the last decades, a very strong issue. The way that we consider it now, and thanks for making the point, actually, because it's important to sort of note that we are looking in many ways at a dual transition, not only sort of the ecological change, but also rapid technological change. And it's very difficult, sometimes not necessary, to separate those two topics. They go hand in hand in many cases. Technology will solve some problems, but not all in terms of the climate crisis. And in all those cases, we have to have frameworks and tools and methods, at least in our toolbox from the labor side, to address those. And in most ways, I think that the way that we approach this is that we tackle them with the same instrument instruments, essentially. What we need is adherence from governments and businesses to the fundamental labor rights as enshrined in the ILO standards, as well as in the Declaration of Human Rights. That we have those things, and once we have dependable and free trade unions, collective bargaining, social dialogue, without interference by any other bodies, then we can actually make a lot of progress on these issues that can result in social equitable outcomes for not just the workers themselves and the companies, but for the entire communities around them that are affected.
Thanks a lot for that answer. Sorry. I think we need to unfortunately wrap up because we have another session also by the UNFCCC. And just to quickly answer the questions on the state-owned enterprises versus local enterprises, of course, I think that both entity plays an important role. But of course, when it comes to the renewable energy transitions, the state-owned, I think, enterprises also have a more, I would say they are all like equally responsible for the transitions, but I guess that the public policy will be more have more impact on of course, the state-owned entities, and I think they both play a very important role. I don't know if that answered the question. Sorry about that. But thanks everyone. Please refer to the latest publication from the KCI. Thanks KCI, UNFCCC for hosting this event. UNDP also has our publication on the just transition if you are interested. And then we'll just close this session today. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the panelists. I don't know what I did. Thank you.